Pleasure to have you here to celebrate this really generous gift to the National Park Service and to all of us from Frankie. So the Lincoln Institute, if you don't know, we work globally, and what we try to do is help governments at all levels, local, state, provincial, national governments, to use land policy as a way to address big challenges that they might face, like climate crisis, or how to protect large landscapes for critical endangered species, right? Those are the small things, and some of the bigger things we do, of course, is help local governments to collect taxes to pay for the public goods through the property tax. We've been at it for about 75 years, and we work. Our main office is here, right here where we're sitting. We have an office in Phoenix. We have a center in Beijing, China, in Peking University. We have a center in Pretoria, South Africa, in the University of Pretoria. We work in about 19 different countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we've been working in most of Eastern Europe since the wall came down in 1989, helping those countries to build a fiscal base under their local government. So it's something that we love to do. And I know that land is big to us, but land, I'm sure, is big to the National Park Service as well. So this house is, so one of the privileges we have of being here in Cambridge is we own 2 of the 3 Longfellow houses. So we own this house, which is the house that is also known as the Edith Longfellow Dana House. And we also own the house next door, which is also sometimes known as the President's House at the Lincoln Institute. So Tootie, my wife, and I live there. But it's also the Alice Thorpe, Longfellow Thorpe. Annie Longfellow Thorpe. Sorry. And every Christmas we do kind of an open tour of all the 3 houses with the Park Service, and we invite you all to join us then for some hot chocolate and some stories. But it was at the last Sisters tour that we actually met Frankie, and Tootie and Frankie became fast friends. And then Frankie came by to see exactly where we put the Christmas tree in the house next door at Christmas that year. So that was really touching. Because as you told us, you called the house the tree because that's where you went to open your Christmas presents every Christmas. So it's great to have you back. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Chris Began. Chris has been a great partner. He helped us to really endure the brain damage of going through a historic renovation of this house, which took us the last 2 years, right after we went for 3 years at the house next door. But now we've hopefully restored them to their historic glory. I think they're looking quite nice. And I hope you get to enjoy the grounds as well as the Longfellow house. So Chris, why don't you take it from here? Thank you very much.
Mac, for that kind introduction, and thank you to you, to Tootie, and to Kate and the entire Lincoln team for having us here tonight. We're really so lucky to have you as our next door neighbor. So I thank you. I really appreciate that. And the Friends of the Longfellow House, who are our philanthropic nonprofit, as well as the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, for sponsoring the beautiful reception that we just enjoyed upstairs. It was just a real treat and such a nice way to kick off this celebration tonight. So thank you for that as well. Before we dive in, I wanted to cover a couple logistics. I'm like a flight attendant. So emergency exits back in that corner, also out the glass doors and up the stairs where you came in. For anyone who needs a restroom, they're at the end of this hallway out the glass doors to your left. So super easy to find. If you have any questions, just ask someone who looks like me and we'll help you get there. So with that, thank you so much for gathering tonight to celebrate Waiting for the Boats and its incredible donation to the National Park Service. As Max said, I'm Chris Began. I'm the site manager of the Longfellow House, and it's just a real treat to be here with you tonight. There are, of course, so many people who got us to this point tonight, but fundamentally, I think there are 2. One is Winslow Homer, who painted this incredible painting that you've all just seen in the Longfellow House and are going to hear so much about tonight from Sylvia Yunt. The second is Frankie Wetherall, who is with us tonight, who is such a dear friend to the Longfellow House and who gave Waiting for the Boats to the National Park Service. Frankie, as many people probably know, is also Fanny and Henry Longfellow's great-granddaughter. So I will just say, since the Longfellow House became a unit of the National Park Service 51 years ago, Frankie and her family have truly been the best friends that we could ever hope for. Frankie has incredibly generously given of her memories, her stories of family, her stories of the house, her time. She's helped to make some connections with people who are integral to the house to this day. And also given the National Park Service family papers and objects that help us to tell a much broader story of her family's history. You know, as we built a new family after the National Park Service took over the property, Frankie has become such an integral part of that family. And we are just so grateful to call you a part of our family. So thank you. And I know as you know, Frankie was deciding where Waiting for the Boat should live in perpetuity. You told me that, you know, keeping it in the family was important to you. And that meant keeping it with the family collection in the Longfellow House. But of course, by choosing to give it to the National Park Service, you've also ensured that, you know, it's a true gift to the American people, that it will be available to all of us in perpetuity. And so this is a really, really exciting moment indeed to see this painting kind of put in public trust and celebrated in this way. So Frankie, on behalf of the National Park Service and especially the team next door at the Longfellow House, thank you. A huge thank you. I also wanted to acknowledge tonight, Frankie is joined by family members, her niece Robin and her nephew Peter. And I wanted to thank you both for all of your support of this donation and for being such great friends to the Park Service as well. We really appreciate it. I think Peter and Robin might be familiar to some people from the annual Henry Longfellow birthday celebration at Mount Auburn Cemetery every year. You're an integral part of that. I'd also be remiss not to mention that Peter is an incredible musician who is going to be back here in July performing as part of the Summer Arts Festival at the Longfellow House. So July 22nd, 3 p.m. Hope everyone comes back out to hear Peter, incredible guitarist. I would also be remiss not to thank David Daly, a longtime curator of the Longfellow House. David worked very closely with Frankie on this donation and worked to get the painting reframed in a historically appropriate frame and put up for exhibit. So thank you, David, for everything. Really appreciate it. And on that note, I'm going to pass it off to David to introduce our guest speaker and our plan tonight for everyone who wants to know. Our hope is to get you out of here by 7:30. So Sylvia, I know, has a 30-40 minute presentation, maybe a little more. We've got a little time for Q&A at the end, and I'll come back up, I'll moderate, and then we'll get you home and to dinner in time. So thank you so much, and David Daly. Yeah, thank you.
Before we get to the main event. So, Chris said, my name is David Daly. I am the museum curator over at the Longfellow House, and thank you all so much for coming out tonight. We are really pleased to welcome you here to join us marking the addition of this work to the site's art collection. It's quickly become a premier example of the extended Longfellow family's interest in and love for art. We are equally thrilled to welcome as our speaker tonight, Sylvia Young. Sylvia is the Lawrence A. Fleischman Curator in charge of the American Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York City, where she is responsible for the administrative and curatorial oversight of the Department of Historical Works by African American, Euro-American, Latin American, and Native American artists from the colonial period to the early 20th century. Before moving to the Met, she served as Chief Curator and Louise B. and J. Harwood Cochran Curator of American Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and the Margaret and Terry Stent Curator of American Art and Department Head at the High Museum of Art. She began her curatorial career at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, America's oldest art school museum. And in addition to completing collection reinstallations at former institutions, she has organized major exhibitions with accompanying catalogs on Winslow Homer, including last year's exhibition at the Met Winslow Homer Cross Currents, Jacob Lawrence, Historical Native American Art, Celia Bow, Maxfield Parrish, and American Modernism, among other topics focused on women and artists of color in regional and national contexts. She recently opened an exhibition on late 19th century New York art worlds and their intersecting networks of artists, critics, and collectors. and is leading an American Wing reinstallation to mark the department's centennial in 2024. She continues to lecture and publish widely on American art and culture, as well as on issues of curatorial responsibility and museum practice. So please join me in welcoming her to the podium, Sylvia Young. Thank you so much for coming.
What a pleasure to be here tonight and to meet Frankie especially and celebrate this wonderful gift to not only the National Park Service, but specifically to the Longfellow House and that local wonderful family story. I do want to also thank some other people, specifically, of course, David and Chris, and also another NPS colleague of ours in Richmond, who I knew in Richmond, Ethan Bullard, who was the one who informed me of this acquisition. Actually, I guess there's some internal newsletter that he got wind of, a Bowdoin College graduate, great fan of Winslow Homer, and immediately emailed me to say that this was entering the collection. And I happened to be in England at the time for the Winslow Homer exhibition in London. So it was all meant to be, perfect synergies. I also want to thank Kate Hansen-Plass for all of her generous answering of my many questions, and for sharing the inventories, the art inventories of the original owner, Thomas G. Appleton. And then certainly the Boston Cambridge history, exhibition history and provenance of this picture makes it so relevant, particularly relevant for the Longfellow Sites collection. And again, it's really refreshing to see a work of art like this featured in a historic house that also is part of this national collection. So I really should have titled my talk From Cambridge to Cullercoats and Back Again. So some of you may know, and actually let's look at some images. Let's do that. Here we go. Some of you may know that Winslow Homer was born in 1836 in Boston to Henrietta Benson Homer and Charles Savage Homer, and at the age of 8, moved across the Charles to Cambridge. The family first lived in the somewhat industrial area of Dana Hill, moving 5 years later to the quieter Cambridge Commons neighborhood, specifically 8 Garden Street, which has since been, of course, supplanted by Radcliffe, but just a few blocks from here, from the Longfellow House and its celebrity resident. And I probably don't need to remind this audience that 1848, the year that the Homer family relocated to Cambridge, followed the publication of their neighbor's epic poem, Evangeline, which I believe, according to David, confirmed this, is still considered to be one of Longfellow's most famous and widely read, both during his lifetime and today. So one of Homer's greatest admirers, the enlightened critic, Mariana Griswold Van Rensselaer, ascribed what she termed his concern for rustic humanity to Cambridge's country life. And it really was a country life, then I gather, that, quote, fostered the tastes and feelings in his art, an observation that might also be made, of course, about Longfellow and his historical narratives. Homer's Waiting for the Boats was purchased in 1883 by the Boston writer, patron of the arts, friend of Longfellow, and husband of the poet's sister, Frances, that is Thomas G. Appleton, from Homer's then New Boston Gallery, Dahl and Richards, 1 year after it was produced in England. And I'm showing you an 1884 photograph of Appleton's dining room at 10 Commonwealth Avenue, where Homer is visible. I only know this because David pointed it out to me, but it's just visible in a jumble of art objects on a mantle at right. Can you see that? I believe it's right here. Oh, you think, I'm sorry, of course, that's what I meant. There we go. But this is interesting too, maybe that's the other one. I only saw this in a slide earlier. So, yes, and so the watercolor that he acquired was among 51 featured in the rather famous solo exhibition at Dahl and Richards in December 1883, the most extensive US display of Homer's English watercolors to date. This was also the show that established the artist's critical and financial success with the popular medium. Van Rensselaer, writing in 1883 that she had not been a fan of his earlier work. In fact, she remembered she, quote, hated Mr. Homer in quite vehement and peculiar fashion, acknowledging thereby his individuality and his force. Van Rensselaer went on to praise his English watercolors in a New York exhibition in '83 as, quote, not only the most complete and beautiful things he has yet produced, but among the most interesting American art, has yet created. As mentioned, Waiting for the Boats dates from the artist's consequential 18-month stay, April 1881 to November 1882, in the Northumberland fishing village of Cullercoats, just north of the city of Newcastle. Inspired by the daily life and death experiences of local women and men inextricably tied to the ocean, Homer produced that in that seaside outpost, some 70 black and white drawings, 55 watercolors, and 7 oils, the largest body of work in his career exploring any one location. And he continued to draw specifically from his English motifs throughout 1883 and 84, and we could argue even later than that. With an intensity of focus and productivity, Homer explored in Cullercoats themes of danger and survival, as well as the quieter rhythms of village life, especially the activities of fisherwomen, as seen in the Longfellow watercolor and this echoing 1881 work from Harvard's collection. Locating these liminal lyrical images at the harbor and along the water's edge, where the community awaited the return of the fishermen from their labors on the harsh North Sea. Homer's formative residency in Cullercoats shaped all of his subsequent art. It also affected him personally, leading to his decision to relocate permanently in 1883 from Manhattan to his developing family compound in Prouts Neck, Maine, where he painted his most familiar images of sea and surf, deeply influenced again by his English period. In artistic terms, the sea has no boundaries, no borders. Scholars have long viewed Homer's time on the Northumbrian coast, what the English refer to as the Northeast, not too far from the border with Scotland, as transformative to his development as an artist. And one could argue that it was also a pivotal life experience for him, perhaps only second in importance to the American Civil War, which marked his coming of age as a man and an artist. It's interesting to consider why it was an English watercolor scene that appealed to Appleton, given that Homer chronicled some of the most turbulent decades of American history from the beginning to the end of his career. Indeed, close study of the artistic production, his artistic production, reveals a lifelong preoccupation with conflict and uncertainty, as well as persistent concerns with race, gender, class, and the environment. This was the interpretive framework that my American Wing curatorial colleague, Stephanie Herdrick, and I brought to our 2022 exhibition that David mentioned, Winslow Homer Cross Currents, which partly led, I think, to my invitation to be here today with you. We are privileged at the Metropolitan Museum to steward many canonic works of art, including one of the largest concentrations of Homer's output in oil, watercolor, graphite, and print media from across his prolific career. And we're committed to sharing new ways of thinking about this material with our broad publics by asking fresh questions of the artist and artworks. I wonder if any of you were able to experience our Homer exhibition when it was on view in New York last spring. And Chris, yes, said, oh, great. Oh, wonderful. Thank you all. Last spring and summer. But so those of you who did, you'll know it was an ambitious effort featuring 88 works from 43 public and private lenders, with a quarter coming from the American Wings collection. Indeed, it was the most extensive look at Homer's art and life in more than 25 years. The last retrospective was organized by the National Gallery of Art in Washington, then seen at the MFA Boston. Some of you may have seen it there. And then it traveled to the Met in between 1995 and 96. And then a smaller version of our exhibition, the 2022 show, traveled to London's National Gallery, where it was on view last fall, as I mentioned. In the Cross Currents exhibition and its accompanying catalog, Stephanie and I used the lens of conflict to pose timely questions about Homer's production that addresses consequential social and political issues of his day, war, slavery, imperialism, as well as the fragility of human life and the sublimity of nature. We argued that a persistent fascination with struggle across his career permeates Homer's powerfully humane paintings and watercolors, both formally and emotionally, revealing enduring concerns with race, nature, and the environment that clearly resonate with contemporary viewers, and we certainly saw that in the responses to the show. These urgent themes are present in Homer's earliest Civil War and Reconstruction paintings, for example, Prisoners from the Front from the Met's collection, and The Cotton Pickers from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Such poignant and symbolic paintings reveal Homer's wartime experiences as a sketch artist, accompanying George McClellan's Army of the Potomac in 3 Virginia campaigns, in addition to addressing the uncertain future of the reunified country, especially for newly emancipated Black Americans. Issues of conflict and sentiment are also evoked in surprising and nuanced ways in Homer's subsequent waterside images, such as Breezing Up a rare painting of seemingly radiant hopefulness marking the nation's centennial, but one that seems to anticipate the formal composition of later, more charged works like the Gulf Stream, which was the focal point of our exhibition. And then there's the Met's ambiguous eagle head with its eerie atmosphere of female modernity. These supposedly lighthearted works intimate darker themes, foreshadowing the artist's growing preoccupation with seascapes that center the hardships of marine life. As I noted earlier, Homer brought deeper gravitas to his increasingly ambitious art following his formative year and a half in the Northumberland fishing village of Cullercoats, producing dramatic narratives of unknown outcomes, such as the lifeline and Lost on the Grand Banks, soon after his return to the States. And in these works, inspired by his Cullercoats imagery and experiences, Homer highlighted gender and class dimensions of sea perils, modern heroism, and human vulnerability in the face of the dynamic power of nature, themes that really would consume him the rest of his days. Our Cross Currents exhibition also took seriously Homer's famous statement about the importance of his work in watercolor to his successful career and artistic legacy. "You will see in the future I will live by my watercolors," he once wrote to his dealer. The Caribbean watercolors in particular are celebrated for their technical brilliance and fluidity, and as we argued in the exhibition, are far more than just winter work produced during southern sojourns away from Maine, as they've generally been regarded. Instead, we interpret them as imagery in which Homer explores on an intimate scale the profound subjects that preoccupied him throughout his career: dramatic scenes of distress on the ocean, conflict between humans and nature, and the transience of life. We were thrilled to feature so many of these rarely seen watercolors. More than half the works in the exhibition were actually watercolor, including his inventive images of fishing in Canada and these sparkling depictions of his tropical travels throughout the Caribbean, especially the Bahamas, and then to Cuba and Florida as well. The Met's iconic The Gulf Stream, the first of Homer's works to be purchased by the museum, and that was in 1906, was at the center of our project. The striking depiction of a lone Black seaman seemingly facing his imminent demise on a distressed boat, threatened by sharks and a waterspout in the powerful Atlantic current, has confounded generations of viewers with its personal and existential, social, and political potential meanings. Initially inspired by the artist's earlier travels to the Bahamas and Cuba in the 1880s, the Gulf Stream is a spectacular scene of unresolved disaster. As Homer's only major seascape set in the Caribbean, it also surfaces various social, political, and historical issues of the era, including the legacy of slavery and imperialism in the wake of the Spanish-Cuban-American War, now known as the War of 1898. When Homer explained that, quote, "the subject of this picture is comprised in its title," he suggested that he understood the significance of the mighty Atlantic Ocean current, the Gulf Stream, and its historical role in the transatlantic slave trade, as well as in the larger ecosystem. And he evoked its power in a number of works, including this related watercolor that suggests a more definitive end to the painting's narrative of struggle. The exhibition featured other well-known oils that reveal the potency of nature, mortality, and violent beauty, such as the Met's Northeaster and Fox Hunt from the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, my former museum, Homer's first painting to enter a public collection. So after all the sturm and drang, we closed the exhibition quietly with a room of breathtaking experimental watercolors, the medium in which one might argue the artist most excelled, finding a liberating analog between its formal qualities and his favorite waterbound subjects. Overall, our hope was that visitors would take away from the Cross Currents exhibition and catalog a deeper understanding of the complexity and contradiction of Homer's art that mirrors American life in compelling visual ways. Now, our exhibition certainly emphasized the centrality of Homer's transformative period in Cullercoats, but we did that selectively with just 5 works, 3 watercolors and 2 oils, some produced in England and some finished right after the artist returned to New York in December of 1882. And one of those paintings is actually just around the corner here. You can't see it. It's Worcester, the Worcester Art Museum's wonderful Gale that actually began in Cullercoats and it turned into a Proud's Next subject, one of those very interesting transitional pictures for Homer. The watercolors, though, The Wreck of the Iron Crown, Inside the Bar, and Perils of the Sea, were highlighted in the exhibition as strategic examples of the critical transition of Homer's working method in that famously difficult medium of watercolor, and at the same time both echoed and anticipated aspects of his painting in oil. As I've already shared, Homer scholars have consistently discussed how the artist's time in Cullercoats informed all of his subsequent production, especially subjects dealing with sea perils, life-saving and fishing. For example, these two masterworks, also in Massachusetts collections, Undertow from the Clark in Williamstown, and the Fog Warning from the MFA, I'm sure a painting you all know very well. Other writers have connected Homer's earlier interests in rural subjects, whether in France or the Catskill Mountains of New York, to his Cullercoats works, linking them to the widespread fascination with the continuance of pre-industrial cultural traditions in the face of rapid industrialization, so peasant painting, both abroad and at home, something that may have partly determined the appeal of England's Northeast for the artist. The installation of our Cross Currents exhibition also tangibly revealed to me, and maybe for the first time, the resonance between Homer's Cullercoats work and his earlier Civil War and Reconstruction representations of Black Americans, namely through their shared themes of women awaiting profound outcomes with uncertainty and trepidation, in addition to the monumentality and force of the figures themselves. For example, as in these works near Andersonville and Dressing for Carnival. But it was really the intervening section in the exhibition, what we termed his waterside imagery, that may have offered visitors the clearest indication of Homer's creative growth as a colorist, as well as a painter of gravitas, especially when it came to his work in watercolor. In effect, the artist grew up with watercolor, as his mother, Henrietta Benson Harmer, a talented amateur who specialized in flora and fauna studies, was his first teacher. Significantly, Homer's career witnessed the transition of watercolor from an educational medium largely associated with upper-class women and children to one embraced by professional male painters as an experimental and even progressive art form. Homer first began experimenting with watercolor in a more ambitious way during the summer of 1873, while visiting the Cape Ann fishing community of Gloucester, which had also become a popular artist colony, so not that dissimilar from Cullercoats' identity a decade later when he visited there. The year is telling. By 1873, the 37-year-old artist had been a working professional for some 20 years, largely earning his living as a freelance illustrator, while also developing a reputation for distinctive oil paintings of Civil War and Reconstruction era subjects. That Homer chose to refocus his talents in watercolor that very year, 1873, speaks to the increased market for the art form, spurred by such pivotal developments as the earlier founding of the American Society of Painters in Watercolors, whose annual exhibitions created important opportunities for critical attention as well as for sales. In 1873, the Society hosted an international exhibition of some 600 European as well as British and American watercolors and drawings that proved to be transformative for the American art world, leading many to view the art form with a newfound greater seriousness, and Homer was certainly among them. This landmark showing may also have influenced the artist's decision to visit England in 1881, a few years later, perhaps with the focused intention of advancing his skill in watercolor painting, and more on that shortly. Homer's Gloucester watercolors from the summer of 1873 artfully capture, with the illustrator's eye for incident and line, tensions between the working class village and the picturesque pilgrimage site for artists that he encountered there. Indeed, tragedy and its potential informed even seemingly lighthearted activities of local children, boating, helping with chores, or playing on the dunes and wharves. In A Basket of Clams, left, one of the earliest watercolors by the artist in the Met's collection, Homer depicts two boys lugging their haul across the beach. One appears to notice the dead shark at left, while the other seems to look back at the sailboat, details that complicate this otherwise bright scene, gesturing to very real threats Gloucester youth might someday face at sea. But it's in works like the poignant Waiting for Dad, also known as Longing, where Homer directly addresses the dangers of life and loss in the fishing village. In fact, according to Bill Cross's great work on the Gloucester community and Homer's time there. During his visit to the town, to Gloucester in August 1873, a single storm destroyed 9 fishing vessels and 128 soldiers, sorry, my Civil War moment, 128 sailors did not return home. Another Gloucester watercolor of 1873, Waiting for the Boats, offers another suggestive comparison to the Longfellow houses, later work by the same title. Chris loves this watercolor, I'm showing you it right here. Not only does it reveal the very different formal approaches Homer brought to the medium, but the mood of the pictures is also distinctive. In the earlier, very experimental drawing, gouache or opaque color, the white that you see there, and the high-keyed tones predominate, built up in dark to light layers as if he were working on an oil painting. 8 years later in Cullercoats, Homer is painting more assuredly with enveloping, transparent color washes, producing a greater atmospheric harmony overall. Both watercolors suggest to me a somewhat melancholy, if sun-dappled air, but the Gloucester image feels more charged than the gesture, through the gesture of the figure at right, who with that outstretched arm seems to be consoling his companion, underlining the anxiety of waiting on a relative safe return from a fishing expedition. In contrast, the Cullercoats scene feels calmer, with the young women protagonists, their backs to the sea, you notice, contemplating the more thinly painted figures in the dory at right, rather than noticeably anticipating return of the boats. Before we take a closer look at the Longfellow House watercolor, let's consider the broader context for Homer's time in Cullercoats. Despite the amount of ink spilled on the consequential period by writers both then and now, we don't know for certain the reasons that led the artist to spend 19 months in the remote fishing village. Homer was famously reticent about much of his life and work, employing wit and sarcasm to deflect questions about the meaning of his art. And this has created a great deal of conjecture, speculation, and downright lore in the scholarship. As paper conservator and Homer expert Judith Walsh has noted, Homer never spoke about his time in Cullercoats to the press, and no personal letters remain from that period in his life. What we do have is a body of remarkable work, primarily in watercolor, that he regularly sent to exhibition in Boston and New York, both during his time abroad and after his return to the States. These breathtaking English images, larger in scale and more ambitious compositionally and emotionally, and I hope those of you who went over to see the wonderful watercolor in the house just really notice the scale of that work. This has led to the convincing argument that Homer sailed for Liverpool in March 1881 with the express purpose of furthering his study and practice of watercolor painting. And I'm showing you 2 rarely seen Cullercoats works from Harvard's collection, one painted on site when it left in 1881, and the other produced after Homer's return to New York in 1883, fascinating scenes that reveal the diversity of the North Sea fishing industry. This later work, the work at Wright, actually can be seen right now on view in the current exhibition at Harvard, American Watercolors 1880 to 1990, Into the Light, which is on view through mid-August. So if you haven't seen that exhibition yet, wonderful to spend time with this watercolor and then walk across the park to see, that other one. And I actually gather from Chris and David that the museum's director, Martha Tedeschi, who was a respected Homer scholar, watercolor scholar especially, has written thoughtfully, and she's written thoughtfully about the oral and sensory qualities of Homer's Cullercoats images, has recently spent some time looking at the work with you, and I'm sure that was really rewarding for everyone. Homer lingered in London for just a few weeks in the spring of 1881, and this watercolor it left, a rather conventional view of the Houses of Parliament, if done in a very Whistlerian style, is his only known artwork that exists from that visit to the city. And apparently that was enough time to seek out the National Gallery, watercolors and oils by the great J.M.W. Turner, the English artist he had long admired. Homer first saw Turner's epic and harrowing Slave Ship, now in the MFA's collection, of course, in New York in 1872, in a private showing at the home of the painting's then owner, John Taylor Johnston, who was the first president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and an important patron of Homer's. He was actually the first owner of Prisoners from the Front. Homer also visited contemporary exhibitions of English painting and watercolor while he was in London before heading north. But what led him to Cullercoats? According to one account, Homer was said to have communicated to a young resident of the village that he was seeking atmosphere and color. Whether apocryphal or not, he was sure to find that in the already well-known, if unassuming, fishing community that had become a holiday resort as early as the 18th century for the English middle and working classes, and by 1820, an artist colony, drawing painters from nearby Newcastle and inspiring articles in English magazines popular in America throughout the late 19th century. As the art historian Helen Cooper has suggested, Homer may even have heard of Cullercoats during his summers in Gloucester, as the international fishermen population there included a large number of English immigrants. It is hard to discount that Cullercoats' rugged coastline, climate, and fishing folk, with their distinctive way of life, might have reminded Homer of his native New England, especially the communities he encountered in Gloucester and Maine. But whereas in those regions, he largely focused on children and men as pictorial subjects, in England, it was the women, so different from the stylish upper-class figures he painted in New York, and so central to the life of the Northumbrian coastal village, that attracted his keenest attention. By the summer of 1881, Homer was comfortably installed in a rented fisherman's cottage with a private garden and gate. He also found a well-sited studio on a cliff overlooking Cullercoats Harbor, with a southern view that stretched as far as the ruins of the Tynemouth Castle and Priory. Popular with other artists, they only appear in ghostly outline in a few of Homer's works, such as this one at right. See that, yes, just between the women and the sail. And then down to the bustling Cullercoats sand and breakwater, which really became his favorite subject. It's important to state that it was Homer's direct engagement with life there, on the beach and breakwater in all kinds of weather, mixing with the locals and paying the fishermen, fisherwomen, and girls to model for him, that determined the power and beauty of his Cullercoats work. Attesting to this immediacy, conservators have found bits of sand embedded in some of his English watercolors, as if they've blown onto the paper, onto the sheet while drying. Yes, Homer may have been inspired by his encounter with Greek sculpture, particularly the Parthenon marbles at the British Museum, and as well as other major European works of art he saw in London, encouraging a greater monumentality in his statuesque figures. The critic Van Rensselaer referred to it as sculptural grace, which is very evident in these two watercolors. And as he did throughout his career, Homer drew from pictorial conventions, reusing motifs and compositions from earlier imagery, particularly the Gloucester watercolors, likely a result of his creative practice as an illustrator. But there's unquestionably a freshness and a vitality to the English scenes that remains distinctive in his ode, and that reveals this lived experience he had there. I would argue that he found something similarly powerful in the penetrating African-American subject matter he drew from his Reconstruction era travels throughout Virginia. But in Cullercoats, the charged presence of race, if not class, was absent. Fisherwomen have a long history as popular subjects in 19th century British and European so-called peasant painting. And the working women of Cullercoats, with their fresh looks and colorful dress, were generally considered to be among the village's most compelling and attractive features. There were even English folk songs written about the Cullercoats fish lass. What distinguishes Homer's representations of them from the standard romanticized genre is a lack of overt nostalgia and sentimentality. And if the majority of his renderings may not read as portraits of individual women per se, in only a few do they come across as real archetypes. For example, the Met's Inside the Bar, which drew tremendous critical favor on its first display in the 1883 exhibition of the American Watercolor Society in New York. Art historian and watercolor expert Kathleen Foster has discussed this dramatic work as, quote, distilling all the formal lessons that Homer had learned in Cullercoats, and argues that the artist clearly intended it as a bravura exhibition watercolor show print. Working on a large sheet of paper, he perfected elaborate English watercolor techniques, laying out the innovatively designed composition with broad overlapping washes of color and refined drawing. Both then and now, Inside the Bar has been seen as a benchmark of Homer's new pictorial ambitions and confidence that also foregrounds the daily heroism of the stoic fisherwoman against these awesome natural forces. As another critic wrote in 1883, This woman is not made of the stuff that is swept away. She is transformed by the terrible beauty of the time and place. Her stride is magnificent. She is part of the storm itself. And I should note that while Homer occasionally pictures men and women together in his Cullercoats imagery, and I've shown you a few already, actually many in the Harvard collection, it turns out, the men with their faces obscured by their oilskin gear are far more generalized than the women, who more regularly appear alone or in groups with other female figures, such as the men's inside the bar and the Longfellow houses waiting for the boats. Homer's Cullercoats period also represents the first time he had left New York for more than a summer of creative work, common practice for urban artists then and now. The year and a half that he spent on the Northumbrian coast meant he experienced not only the gentler, warmer summer months, but also the wilder rawness of the sea during harsh winters, when storms and the potential for disaster were far more frequent. As would be the case with his 1883 year-round move to Pratt's Neck, Homer relished the time after the tourists and the other artists had gone, using the fall and winter months for what he referred to as concentrated hard work. This more encompassing experience and immersion in the life of the community led to basically two different types of Cullercoats watercolors for Homer. One, perilous and dark, such as this one at left, Perils at Sea, and the other placid, well, these are, I'm sorry, we're off my line of images here. Perilous and dark, like these two images, Perils of the Sea and Watching the Tempest, from the collections of the Clark and Harvard respectively. And the other one, such as Waiting for the Boats, with that wonderful all over gentle warm glow. During his residency in Cullercoats, Homer quickly embraced the community's age-old rhythms of daily life, documenting the fishing boats or cobles, vessels dating from the 6th century, setting sail at dusk, then returning in the early morning. The boats were met by fisherwomen and children who divided the catch according to the share of the boats owned by their family. The fish was then collected in wicker baskets and creels of different sizes, scaled to support as much as 50 pounds, and carried by the women on their shoulders, door to door, some 10 miles inland to Newcastle and other Tyneside towns. Given this schedule, Homer spent far more time with the women residents of Cullercoats, the backbone of the community for generations. Yet change was near, with greater industrialization encroaching, especially in the advent of steam trawlers along the busy River Tyne, just 2 miles to the south of Cullercoats Harbor. The steamers had begun to replace the ancient cobles, and in 1882, the coming of the railroad to nearby Tynemouth made Cullercoats far more accessible for day trippers and artists, while impacting the transport and sale of fish to market by the villagers, who had become ever more reliant on income from summer visitors. What's most fascinating to me about the Longfellow House watercolor is that it reveals these different aspects of the Cullercoats fishing industry in 1882, with the ghostly steam trawler on the horizon far left, and the substantial, expertly rendered coble, foreshortened and foregrounded off-center and reflected in the wet sand, with unusually inactive fisherwomen, one bareheaded, suggesting her possible youth, as well as the warmth of the day, relaxing on its stern, seemingly at leisure and an easy conversation, rather than anxiously alert to the anticipated arrival of the fishermen with their catch. Homer detailed the women's serge wool skirts with their distinctive pleats, as well as their colorful aprons or pinnies. He also paid special attention to the differing scale of the large creels and the smaller wicker baskets, perhaps intended for collecting mussels or swills for baited lines, if not reserved for their own groceries, purchased while making the rounds selling fish. To the immediate left of the low cliff and headland at far right, known in Cullercoats as the Caves, site of an earlier smuggling enterprise, a thinly painted side view of either a coble or a dory, which is to me suggestive of some of Homer's Gloucester imagery, appears to hold two fishermen in oilskin, perhaps untangling and sorting a line of corks that run along the top of a salmon or herring net, while another figure, gender indeterminate, but now that I've seen it in person, probably another fisherman, leans on the stern and seems to make eye contact with the main female protagonists. You might well wonder where a New Yorker comes by this precise Tyneside lingo, And I want to credit the friends I made on my own formative pilgrimage to Cullercoats before heading to London for the opening of our Cross Currents exhibition last fall, in effect reversing Homer's English journey. What I encountered surprised me and my always adventurous sister, who was along for the ride, a considerable interest in knowledge of the artist's 1881 to 82 residency, centered around the committed volunteers preserving the famous watch house that appears in much of Homer's Cullercoats imagery. And I want to specifically recognize the efforts of Mick English, who's there in the center, in bringing this living history to a larger public, regionally, nationally, internationally. And I would encourage you to check out their Facebook. It's rather an amazing, amazing place. While in Cullercoats, I also had the great pleasure of meeting and doing a studio visit with the multimedia artist Penelope Payne, who's actually pictured in the other image, whose work had been introduced to me by a colleague at the National Gallery in London. Penny had produced a series of moving works, performances, textiles, organic sculpture, and paintings here in Tar that honor the role of women in the fishing industries of Northumberland, particularly Cullercoats, while gesturing toward Homer's historical example. She's particularly interested in the pleating on many of their skirts, and she sees as really a kind of a statement of the women about the hierarchy of the women in the community, that they would decorate their dresses in such a way. She's also very interested in the language of how these women have been described over the 19th century as kind of these wenches, the fish lasses, and kind of the class-based bias of that. She also has a really informative website I'd recommend. The issue of Homer's lingering artistic influence in Cullercoats after his return to the US has received some attention in the scholarship, especially in England, but also Betsy Athens, Jason Rood's catalog on Homer's work in England. And it was a treat to encounter two decidedly Victorian works in Newcastle's Lang Art Gallery during my visit last summer that revealed this, particularly in terms of Homer's focus on the labor and legacy of fisherwomen. For example, I'm showing you Robert Jobling's 1886 oil on canvas, Darkness Falls from the Wings of Night. Its melancholic title drawn from, I don't have to tell anyone in this room, another famous American, appropriately for us, Longfellow's The Day Is Done lyric poem from 1844, which appeared in a collection of his work published in England 5 years later. And we discussed that earlier today, just the incredible international resonance of Longfellow both during his life and up to the present day. The imposing vertical composition with its hushed tonalities and mood, as well as these transatlantic references to both painter and poet, features a wealth of pictorial elements, the watch house, flanking cottages on the cliff, including the studio that Homer occupied, fleets of kobolds and their open shed on the beach, peopled by fisherwomen bearing creels and nets, details that really suggest the Cullercoats Homer likely encountered in the early 1880s. And then there's the far more histrionic work from 1910, The Women by John Charlton, an anachronistic composition that channels Homer's heroicized women as legendary Amazonian figures, leading this rescue effort, which apparently was inspired by an episode in the village's recent history. And I'd like to end by returning to the subtler Homer in the Longfellow House's collection. What might have it been about waiting for boats that appealed to Thomas Appleton and his descendants, who have taken such special care of the watercolor until it's been generously gifted to the historic site? Based on the inventories of his art collections, Appleton's taste in painting appears to have run to landscapes and marines, both domestic and foreign, in oil and watercolor, from Hudson River School painters, Jasper Cropsey and John Kensett, to later expatriates such as Walter Gay and Elihu Vedder. And there's even an earlier work listed by the revered English landscapist, John Constable. Given that, it's not surprising Appleton would have been drawn to Homer's nuanced and delicate Cullercoats scene. And I gather he did own another Homer, and it's been suggested that it was also purchased from the same 1883 exhibition, so likely another Cullercoats scene. I know that work is ongoing, right, Jim, that you're working on that. So as mentioned earlier, the artist watercolors of England had already attracted considerable positive attention, both in New York and in Boston in 1882, as well as this following year. So by the time of the larger display of at Doll & Richards in December 1883, collectors were surely standing at the ready. And at this time, Homer has not yet placed a painting in a museum collection. meaning his dependency on private buyers was particularly acute. In fact, it would be another decade before Philadelphia's Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, as I mentioned, acquired Fox Hunt, which was Homer's first painting to enter a public collection. The praise lavished on the English watercolors of Dahl and Richards by Boston critics ensured the show's success, and close to half of them sold almost immediately, including this one to Appleton. Writers lauded Homer's, quote, unstrained poetic treatment of his novel subject, with the Boston Evening Transcript calling him both the historian and the poet of the sea and seacoast life, and his watercolors the most artistic of all art mediums. Similarly, Marianne Griswold Van Rensselaer found in Homer's Cullercoats watercolors a perfect melding of form and content, art and feeling, quote, an effect of artistic strength, of artistic dignity and beauty that fall nothing short of grandeur. She continued, they are serious works of high art in spite of their peasant subjects and their watercolor medium. And most appropriately, for work that has found its home at the Longfellow House, she concluded that Homer had, quote, invented in some sort a language of his own, perceiving in his new transatlantic voice the strong, characteristic, personal, though unpolished diction of a provincial poet. And I would add of England, both old and new. Thank you very much.
So much, Sylvia. That was wonderful.
Thank you. We have
I
5
think
minutes.
we got a few minutes.
Any
Any questions in the audience for Sylvia or David? Not for me. I'm not taking any questions today.
Yes,
I just, hello. Hello, Bill. I didn't see you earlier. Hi.
yes, I want to ask a question about a little bit about intention.
Mhm.
As an artist myself, I sometimes don't know what I'm doing. And later on, people look at my pictures and they tell me what I've been doing. So I'm
The
wondering.
role of art historians, right?
So I'm wondering, generally speaking, about Homer. Do we know his intentions?
No, as I said, he was very reticent about that. I mean, he gives us clues, certainly in some of the letters, I think most probably powerfully around the Gulf Stream and how he discusses that painting and what he doesn't say about that painting. But, you know, I think that is kind of the beauty of why this work still speaks to us and is still so powerful, because it does open up so many different directions of thinking about what was he saying? We don't know for sure. But in terms of the Cullercoats material, I think it's fairly clear. There's a real narrative that emerges in all of these works. And if you look at them together, you see him experimenting with himself as an artist, find more innovative ways, have to write from just both very formal terms. As an artist, you would appreciate that. But I think, you know, also telling stories about this community and the power of women in this community, the role of women in this community. But, you know, we always talk about interpretation as being, yes, it's subjective, of course, and we frame it as being suggestive, right? It's not something that we can literally identify or date back to the artist in terms of the artist's intentions. I don't think that should prevent us from thinking about the works and exploring them in different ways. Because why are we still talking about Winslow today? What is it about the work that is still speaking to us? If it was so clearly evident, I don't think we would still be drawn to the work. But intention, it's a very important point. There's still food left
Question
over.
on Mike.
Oh, yes.
Nice presentation. Thank you for doing it. And I may have missed something, but I'm wondering how much like planning he went into the watercolors. Was it just something he sketched on the spot? Did he do different sketches
He
before?
did a lot of drawings, actually, in
He did.
Cullercoats specifically. He actually did more drawings and watercolors there. And if you, there's a wonderful catalog of Racenet. It's, what's it, 4 volumes, built 5 volumes, where you can trace all of the work and really see the amount of work he did in Cullercoats. And, you know, reusing some of these motifs. Many of the watercolors actually, and I couldn't quite see, but it looked like you could see some of the graphite drawing in this work. It's a little high on the wall, but I think, so he was it's very refined, as you see. It's very, very thought out, the placement. The drawings are fascinating because it really shows him thinking through kind of issues and problems and compositions. But these were done for exhibition. These were done to be sold. These were, he was making a statement about his talent and how far he'd come in painting watercolor. They're very different from those Gloucester images and even the works he's doing earlier in the 1870s. So yes, I mean, I think he is approaching them just like, in a way, the critic got it. Mariana Griswold Van Rensselaer, she really got it. That this was high art. These were not kind of commercial illustrators' practice of doing something that amateurs had been doing for years. That even though it's watercolor and it's different kind of subject matter, he was really making a statement about artistic value, his talents at that time. Sort of. But yeah, it's most libraries have, or good research libraries have a copy of Abbey Girth and
What's it called?
It's the Catalogue Raisonné of Homer's work, and it's an extraordinary thing to go through. It's really, and it was a mammoth undertaking started by Lloyd Goodrich, the great historian of American art in the 30s, 40s, and then finished by Abigail Kurtz. Really extraordinary effort. So it gives you a very different picture as opposed to just looking at these images that we see in museum collections to fully understand the practice and the daily sketching that he's doing, rushing out every morning on the beach and doing the graphite sketches, doing charcoal as well, and then working these up in studio. Obviously, he's not painting watercolor on he's doing some watercolor sketches on the beach, but most of them are done in the studio. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just curious, there was a whole group of North Shore artists working in Cornwall at St. Ives,
Yes,
just a little bit
right.
before the Lynn Beach Painters, Woodbury, Green. Were there other artists working with him here, Americans?
I don't know, Bill, I've not heard of any other American artist in the village of Cullercoats in the time he was there, which is why he was kind of such a novelty. But have you come across any? I have
You're
not.
exactly right.
No. And that there were, and you're right, there were many other Americans who were going to Cornwall a little bit later, Haley Lever, other painters. But yeah, and that was a better known and more popular artist colony in Cornwall, of course, St. Ives. But it is kind of extraordinary to think about why he chose this village, and maybe because he knew he wasn't going to be one of 12 or 20 American artists like he found in Gloucester, right? It was very much an active artist colony when he was there. So yeah, there's a wonderful book on British artist colonies. I'm trying to remember their author, Laura, that talks about all the different communities, but most of them formed after Homer was there. A lot of them were late 19th century and early 20th century in terms of.
Does this painting sort of stand by itself as a painting with so much emptiness, so much whiteness, where Homer is almost minimalist for Homer? I was just struck by the contrast between this image and all the other Homers you were showing us, which were so busy with rage and just things going on. But here, there's something restful about it. Can you comment on?
I think that's absolutely true. I think it is a really distinctive composition. And the fact that it's certainly one of those, he did many beautiful watercolors during the summer months, of course, so you see the brightness, the women on the beach, some children, some softer, some quieter images. But it is very unusual. The fact that he didn't center the cobalt, that you would think that would be in the center of the composition. It's very asymmetrical. He's using just the paper, and just a thin wash. And again, I've encouraged Chris and David to think about taking it over to maybe Harvard's Paper Labs to look at this out of its matte frame and to really compare it to, because they have a number of the Cullercoats watercolor from 1881. It would be interesting to think about how he's treating the paper. But yeah, I think it is unusual. And I had never seen it in person before when it was sent to me. And until I saw it, I found it in the Catalogue Raisonné in black and white. It had not been reproduced in color ever, I think. Right? Never seen it reproduced in color. So this is a big deal. It's really exciting that you have this now in this community, and the fact that there's a work in Cambridge, really just down the street from where he lived. I mean, I mentioned the Harvard show, and it's certainly worth going and taking a look at these beautiful things. But I have to admit, I was a little disappointed that there were more than one of the Cullercoats watercolors. They just had the one on view, and they really are extraordinary to see as a group. To your point about process and how we approach them, to really have a better understanding of all the different approaches. So yes, no, it was a great point. It is very distinctive. And on that note, thank you.
Thank you all for joining us tonight.
See a beautiful.
I hope you'll come back. It's just really stunning to see it
Yeah,
this
I
big.
know.
Anyone who's standing right
I
here
know,
knows.
it's amazing.
But please come visit us again at the Longfellow House this summer. We're open Friday through Monday, through October. And we have lots of wonderful Summerfest events planned as well on Sunday afternoons. So we hope to see you again, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so
Sylvia,
much. Thank
your
you.
wonderful talk.
No, thank you.